أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله الذي لا يبلغه مدحته القائلون ولا يحصي نعماءه العادون ولا يؤدي حقه المجتهدون الذي لا يدركه بعد الهمم ولا يناله غوص الفطن الذي ليس لصفته حد محدود ولا نعت موجود ولا وقت معدود ولا أجل ممدود. أما بعد، فقد قال الله الحكيم في محكم كتابه الكريم: أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. حتى إذا جاء أحدهم الموت قال رب ارجعون لعلي أعمل صالحا فيما تركت كلا إنها كلمة هو قائلها ومن ورائهم برزخ إلى يوم يبعثون فإذا نفخ في الصور فلا أنساب بينهم يومئذ ولا يتساءلون فمن ثقلت موازينه فأولئك هم المفلحون ومن خفت موازينه فأولئك الذين خسروا أنفسهم في جهنم خالدون. صدق الله العلي العظيم. صلوات. For the love of our beloved Prophet and his beloved progeny, please recite a second loud salawat. For the hastening in the return of our beloved 12th Imam, a third final loud salawat. We will continue our discussion tonight on the topic of building an Islamic identity. This is a topic we started to discuss in our discussion last night, and we mentioned that this is a topic extremely crucial for us living in this part of the world as Muslims to discuss, because the reality is from a very young age you start to notice that as a Muslim you start to live life very differently from all the other people around you within your society and within your community. Restrictions, regulations, rules that other people don't have in their lives, you all of a sudden do. There are certain things you can't eat, there are certain actions you can't engage in, there are certain individuals you may not be able to have relationships with, and so on and so forth. And therefore, this brings this question to mind as to what is my identity and who am I? Because clearly I'm different from all the other people I see from myself within society. And we said the answer to this question is difficult because the reality is you and I identify in a multitude of different ways. Sometimes based on our ethnicity, sometimes based on where we're born, sometimes based on where we grew up in, and another host of different ways that we identify. And what makes the discussion even more complex is that sometimes these identities start to clash with one another. Your identity sometimes as a husband or a wife or as a relative might clash with your identity as a friend. Sometimes you might have to make a choice between which identity you give preference to, Muslim or non-Muslim, believe in a faith or don't believe in a faith. This is something you deal with in your day-to-day life. And you always end up giving preference to one of these identities over the other one, and mainly and usually the one that is deeper and more essential to who you are as a human being. Whichever of these you give more importance to is the one you're going to give preference to if these identities ever clash with one another. We said Islam expects the same thing from us as well. Let's get to know what your most foundational identity is as a human being. And then if any other identity were to ever clash with this one, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala expects from you and I to give preference and precedence to this identity over the other identity. So we went to the Quran and we asked this question, what is my most foundational identity? We got an answer that was a very humbling answer. And that is, your identity is that you're a servant of somebody who gave you everything you have in life. That person or entity happens to be the entity we refer to as God. He is God because He gave you everything that you have in your life. Hence, your identity is the existence and the being that has zero authority over his own life. We said Islamic philosophers go deeper into this. They call the human being a mumkin amongst the other mumkinats that we have in this world. And we said a mumkin is that being that is so weak he can't even stand on his own 2 feet. In order to exist, it requires someone else to bring him into existence. And in order for him to continue to exist, someone has to give him existence every single second. This is a humbling answer from the Quran. But the Quran said, this is your identity. You are that thing that always needs God to take care of everything for him. Ali ibn Abi Talib described for us what we go through in the womb of our mother. تَمُورُ فِي بَطْنِ أُمِّكَ جَنِينًا لَا تَحِيرُ دُعَاءً وَلَا تَسْمَعُ نِدَاءً. You are that drop of fluid that was in the womb of the mother. You couldn't communicate with anybody. No one else could communicate with you. You needed God to take care of you 24/7, 24/7. And even when He brought you into this world, you didn't know the rules of this world. He had to teach all of that to you as well. So the Quran tells us this is our most foundational identity. Our identity always has God as a part of it. God is part and parcel of it, which is why Surah Al-Hashr, verse number 19 told us that if you ever forget about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you have forgotten who you are yourself. Because God is always part of our equation. We cannot define ourselves without a greater power giving existence to us. The moment you remove that greater power, you no longer exist as a human being. And finally, we mentioned that in Salatul Mayyit, you find that all the other identities of the human being start to disappear. The only identity that was the most foundational and remains for this person is, oh Allah, هَذَا عَبْدُكَ وَابْنُ عَبْدِكَ وَابْنُ أَمَتِكَ. He is a servant of yours, the son or the daughter, depending on the mayyit, of a male servant and a female servant. Tonight, inshallah, we'll continue with this topic and explain how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala expects us that when our identities clash with one another, that we never forget about this core identity of ours. And in order to delve into this topic, we'll pose the following questions. Number one, what identities and roles do we take on in this life that on the day of judgment completely disappear? And which of the identities that we take on in this world remain on the day of judgment? Number two, when everyone is gathered in the area of mahshar, where everyone is brought together on the day of judgment, which are the groups of individuals and categories that stand out amongst all the other servants of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Number three, can I have multiple identities? Can I refer to myself as an American Muslim or a Muslim American? And at the end of the day, what difference do these titles make? What does it mean for me to be an American Muslim or to not be an American Muslim? Number four, what is the story of the young man by the name of Chris Jackson, who was a top NBA prospect, made his way into the league, but at one point saw that his identity as a servant of God and his identity as an employee of the National Basketball Association started to clash with one another? And what did he do about it in his life? Number five, what happens when we forget about our true identity and we start to identify with other things in life? Number six, why is the moment of death easy and somewhat pleasurable for certain individuals and some servants of Allah? And why is that same moment difficult and painful for other servants of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? And what does that have to do with how they used to identify in this world? And number 7, and finally, what were the final words of our beloved Imam al-Hussein that shows how he used to identify himself as a servant that enabled him to take on the calamities and the difficulties of the 10th of Muharram? Tonight, inshallah, we'll delve into these 7 questions with a loud salawat ala Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad. Let us begin from here. The human being, when the moment of death comes, his salatul mayyit is done, this is initially a moment of shock for him. Because all the other identities that he used to have, everything else that he used to think matters, all of a sudden doesn't matter. Only certain things matter for him. Only certain things are going to better his situation in that world. It's a moment of shock. And the Quran tells us and teaches us that this moment of shock continues. The moment of death is just the beginning. Well, then he's going to move on to a next realm. When he moves on to that next realm, he constantly sees that all these identities he used to cling on to are no longer a thing anymore. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the verses of the Quran very beautifully describes these moments for us. These are the verses we started out the lecture today with. He says, حَتَّى إِذَا جَاءَ أَحَدُهُمُ الْمَوْتِ Surah Mu'minun, verses 99 onwards. He says, when the moment of death comes, قَالَ رَبِّ ارْجِعُونَ. He says, oh Allah, take me back. Why? لَعَلِّي أَعْمَلُ صَالِحًا. I want to go back, I want to do some good deeds, so on and so forth. The response comes back, كَلَّا. Definitely not. That's not happening. Kalla is emphatic negation of any possibility. Kalla, innaha kalimatun huwa qailuha. Some have interpreted this line to mean what? That's just some words he's saying, meaning if God were to bring him back, he would continue living life the way he's living life. وَمِن وَرَائِهِمْ بَرْزَخٌ إِلَى يَوْمِ يُبْعَثُونَ. Then the Quran says this, verse 101, فَإِذَا نُفِخَ فِي الصُّورِ. When the barzakh comes to an end and they blow into the trumpets, everything in the world changes. One of those things that changes and makes the day of judgment what it is the following. فَإِذَا نُفِخَ فِي الصُّورِ فَلَا أَنْسَابَ بَيْنَهُمْ يَوْمَئِذٍ. The relationships, the acquaintance, the connections that they used to have with one another, i.e. the identities that they used to have, all of that disappears. فَلَا أَنْسَابَ بَيْنَهُمْ. Those connections, friendships they used to have, all of that starts to disappear. وَلَا يَتَسَاءَلُونَ. Tasa'ul means what? Tasa'ul means when you get to see your friend, you sit and you talk. He asks about you, you ask about him. When you go visit your relatives, yes, you do silatul rahim. That might sometimes be difficult, by the way, in case you haven't noticed. When your mom wakes you up 5 o'clock in the morning and says, come talk on the phone with your cousin who's on the other side of the world, yes? This is part of silatul rahim. When you go and you do tasa'ul, you speak to this other person speaks to you. This is what the Quran says. This doesn't happen on the Day of Judgment. Why? Because those relationships that these guys had, they're gone. فَلَا أَنْسَابَ بَيْنَهُمْ. The nasab, the connection between them is gone. So what does that mean? If I show up on the Day of Judgment, I don't know who's who, and so, no, you know exactly who's who. This is the beauty of the Day of Judgment. You have a complete recollection of all the relationships you had. You know, this is this person, this is the guy who comes from the same tribe as us, same ethnicity, this is my cousin, this is my aunt, you'll remember all of that. Except the relationships don't have that pull anymore. They don't have weight to them anymore. No one does things based off of these relationships anymore. In this world, your relative used to come to you and say, hey, just spread this rumor about this guy. He's creating some problems for me, this, that. This is the relationship you had. Over there, the relationship has zero pull. Doesn't work anymore. That identity doesn't have any more weight behind it. Except for those identities that had to do with you being a servant of God. So the Quran says on that day, Al-akhillau yawma'idhin ba'duhum li ba'din adu. People who used to quote unquote love each other and they were super close friends, on that day they turn into enemies. They recognize each other, they remember each other. You know, this is this guy, I remember meeting this guy, I remember talking to this person, all of that you remember. But the relationships don't have those pull anymore. The identities don't have that meaning anymore. Otherwise, you remember, the Quran tells us there's people in heaven. When they're in heaven, they're in bliss and blessing. They turn around and say, I used to have a friend or an acquaintance who lived very differently from me. Let me go and see where he is. فَطَّلَعَ. So he goes upon hellfire. فَرَآهُ فِي سَوَاءِ الْجَحِيمِ. So he remembers. Except that friendship, that pull is not there if one of these two people was an evil person. If they were both good people, yes, it remains, it is strengthened, it is enhanced. But otherwise, the identities, they disappear. فَلَا أَنْسَابَ بَيْنَهُمْ يَوْمَئِذٍ وَلَا يَتَسَاءَلُونَ. Okay, so what happens then? The Quran says, okay, all of this other stuff goes out the window. So the only thing that matters for you and God in those moments is what? He says, listen, there's only two categories on that day. Two categories. فَمَنْ ثَقُلَتْ مَوَازِينُهُ فَأُولَٰئِكَ هُمُ الْمُفْلِحُونَ. The one who comes with weighty deeds, deeds that have value, فَأُولَٰئِكَ هُمُ الْمُفْلِحُونَ. They're in a good spot. وَمَنْ خَفَّتْ مَوَازِينُهُ. And the one who comes, he has nothing. Then this person, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, أُولَٰئِكَ الَّذِينَ خَسِرُوا أَنفُسَهُم. They lost themselves. They forgot who they were. في عذاب في جهنم خالدون. This one remains in the hellfire. Ya Allah, what about all the other identities? The other identities, those go out the window. This is why Surah Al-Waqi'ah speaks about this. Surah Al-Waqi'ah very beautifully says, when you come on that day, everything changes on the day of judgment. The whole world order, whatever you are used to, it changes. إِذَا وَقَعَتِ الْوَاقِعَةِ لَيْسَ لِوَقْعَتِهَا كَاذِبَةٌ. When that event takes place, and it will definitely take place, you know what that event does? خَافِضَةٌ رَافِعَةٌ. Some people it pulls down, some people it takes up. Recite a salawat, please. One more loud salawat, please. The Quran says that event and that day, خَافِضَةٌ رَافِعَةٌ. Some people it pulls down. Some people it takes up. Some identities worth a lot on that day. That in this world were not worth that much. Some identities, vice versa. So the verses of the Quran continue, and the Quran is trying to tell you that everything on that day starts to change. Nothing is normal. Nothing is the way it used to be. So he says, listen, even those things that used to be super stable, the things that never used to change in this world, on that day will change. What's the most stable thing you know in life? It's the ground you walk on. The ground you walk on, it's never like you took a step and then the ground under you started to tremble. Yes? If you ever thought that, that means you're arrogant. Yes? It never happens. But the Quran says, on that day, إِذَا رُجَّتِ الْأَرْضُ رَجَّةً. When the earth starts to shake, what a shaking. وَبُسَّتِ الْجِبَالُ بَسًّا. And the mountains, they start to explode. They turn into pieces. فَكَانَتْ هَبَاءً مُنْبَثًّا. They turn into dust. Okay, great. So why is the Quran saying all of this? The Quran is saying all of this to say that on that day, there's a new world order. On that day, people are three groups. And these three groups, if you break them down, in reality, they're two. He says, وَكُنْتُمْ أَزْوَاجًا ثَلَاثًا. On that day, you're going to be three groups. In this world, you were like a million different groups. American, Indian, Canadian, this, that, all of this kind of stuff, yeah? Over there, you're going to be three groups. فَأَصْحَابُ الْمَيْمَنَةِ مَا أَصْحَابُ الْمَيْمَنَةِ. There are the people who are going to reach salvation. Good for them. وَأَصْحَابُ الْمَشْأَمَةِ مَا أَصْحَابُ الْمَشْأَمَةِ. There are the people who are going to deal with punishment. It's a really difficult situation. وَالسَّابِقُونَ السَّابِقُونَ. And the people who are just like way ahead of everybody else. They were wonderful. In reality, they're part of the same group of Ashabul Maymana, but the Quran is making a separate category for them just because they're so amazing. Okay, so what about everything else? Nothing else matters. Unless you took from your identities in this world to build any of these identities, then yeah, it can help a little bit. So the Quran says, now imagine if you and I showed up on the Day of Judgment, everyone is gathered on the Day of Judgment. You walk in, you're like, all these people are there. If it's you and I, because we're used to these identities. Excuse me, yeah, I just had one question. Sure, what's your question? Where's the line for the Americans? They're like, that's not a thing. Excuse me, one question. Where's the line for the Arab? They're like, no, that's not a thing here. No, my last name is this. Where do I go? They're like, yeah, that stuff doesn't matter. They don't categorize you based off of that anymore. Where's the first class line? Where do I pay so I get through faster? They're like, no, the wealth thing is not a thing here. Unless you gave it as charity, it's not really a thing here. It's not terrible either, but I mean, it's not really helpful. We don't have a line called the rich people line. It's not how it works. So on the Day of Judgment, you don't have these categorizations. You know what you do have? You have other lines. Except those other lines are based on other realities, not on these realities. They're based on other realities. So the narrations, multiple narrations, speak of this idea. The narration says when everyone is gathered in the mahshar and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has everyone in front of him, quote unquote, then the angels call out different groups. Then there is a first class line, except it's not the one who could pay extra. It's the one who couldn't pay at all. It's a new world order. So the narration says in Al-Kafi, the 6th Imam says, he says on that day the angels, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells them to call out, أَيْنَ فُقَرَاءِ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ. Where are the poor believers? Where are the ones who used to deal with the financial tests that I put in front of them? The narration says they stand up, waiting to see what God has to tell them. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala addresses them. He says, listen, I didn't make you poor in this world. I didn't have you struggle because I disliked you. I tested you with this test because I wanted to honor you on this day. I wanted you to have a special place on this day. So I tested you, and I tested you in a way that I didn't test other people. Very difficult, very difficult. So the narration says, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala addresses them. Says, Ya ibadi, my dear servants, kal mu'tadhiri ilayhim. The narration says, he speaks to them as if he's apologizing to them. As if. There's no apology needed because he's going to make it up to them far greater than anybody else, yes? But the narration says this is how kindly he speaks to them. كَالْمُعْتَذِرِ إِلَيْهِمْ. He says, my servants, ya ibadi, all of you stand up. You have a straight pass into heaven. Everyone else has to do hisab, this, that. You go straight into heaven. As they get up to leave, the narration says, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala adds one more thing. He says, but as you head towards heaven, look amongst the faces of my servants today. See if there's any one of them who helped you in this world. If you see anyone who helped you, grab his hand and take his hand with you. Take him into heaven without hisab too. Are there identities on that day? Yes, there absolutely are. Are the identities the same as these identities? No, it's different lines they have. Then they call out the people who gave charity, stand up, they stand up. The people who did worship in this month, in Rajab, in Ramadan, so on and so forth, these guys stand up. The people who assisted the imam of their time stand up. There are lines, there are categorizations. There is a first class line. Except it's based on your servitude and submission to God. That's the thing. The ones who did this, the one who did that, the one who forgave other people, why don't you stand up? This continues. They come to enter into heaven. You all know heaven doesn't have one gate. So narrations in Shia and Sunni say 8 gates or doors, or however you want to refer to it. They have different doors, different lines, based on different identities. One door is the door of salat. This guy, maybe he wasn't perfect in other areas, but he did a good job with his salat. He really tried. In other areas, he tried to hold back from sin. Sometimes he fell short, but he did a good job with his salat. Salat, we have a lot to say about. Inshallah, the 10th night, we'll talk about salat in depth and in detail. There's a lot of injustice we've done to salat. We have to get back to that topic. This is one of the doors of heaven. One of the doors of heaven is Hajj. This was a person who did his Hajj well. Bismillah. Different doors, different identities. All of them go back to how much of an abd you were, how much of a servant you were. Yes? And then there's one door. This is the door that is my favorite door. There's one door in heaven. It's called Babu Tawbah. It's the door for the one who didn't have the most shining resume. It's the door for the one who messed up a lot. It's the door for the one who did a lot of wrong things. But he repented. There's a whole door for you. There's a whole door in heaven. You know, sometimes people sit back and say, Sheikh, I don't know. Has God really forgiven me or not? Baba, there's a whole door named after you. If you repented, that's where you're headed. Just imagine, this is not a narration, I'm just picturing these moments. Imagine you come onto the day of judgment, yes? And the Quran tells us the moment people are resurrected, they pretty much already know where they're headed. Because their faces are either emanating light, it's showing darkness. Yes, the Quran talks about this, yes? يَوْمَ تَبْيَضُّ وُجُوهٌ وَتَسْوَدُّ وُجُوهٌ. Some are emanating light, some are dark. This is spiritual darkness that they have on their faces, yes? So everyone pretty much already knows where they're headed. But imagine you walk onto the day of judgment and the angels look at you and say, I know you. You're the one who messed up a lot. You did a lot of wrong things. But your face is emanating with light, not because you came with a perfect resume or even close to that. Your face is emanating with light because you're going to enter through Babu Tawbah. You're the one who repented. I know you very well. Are there doors and identities in that world? Yes, but they're based on a very different reality compared to what we're used to. So if this is the identity that matters, now Islam says, listen, if this is your most foundational identity, whatever other identity you take on in life, cool, fine, no problem. But if they ever clash with this one, then you have to give precedence and preference to this one. That's all I ask. If they don't clash, have at it, no problem. Some other identities of ours will never clash with our Islamic identity, never. Some of them, sometimes they might. So this person, he identifies as an employee of a very important organization or corporation or whatever. He's very successful in his career. Yes? We need more Muslims of that sort, who are professionals, who know what they're doing, who do a good job at what they do, so on and so forth, yes? Except now he wants to take on this high-level position, which means now he has to neglect his presence in the house, which means his children are going to be deprived of his presence. Now his identity as that team player in this corporation is clashing with what? His identity as a servant of God. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, no, not here. Everywhere else, no problem. But here, you have to give preference to your most foundational identity. That's what I expect of you. And so on and so forth. He's an amazing friend. Whatever the friends want from him, he's there for them. You know, he's amazing. He's wonderful. Except his friend comes to him and says, listen, we're going to go here. We're going to do this. We're going to do that. We're going to have this haram gathering. Why don't you come over? This is where these two identities are clashing with one another. God expects him to have the maturity to say, listen, I can be a friend right now or I can be a servant of God. Usually these don't clash with one another. In this particular scenario, they are. So, well, I need to be more of a servant of God right now than I am a friend. In this particular scenario. In other scenarios, I can do a lot of things for my friend. Okay, great. So can I have multiple identities? Absolutely. You know, some of these identities, the Quran says we gave you these identities. The Quran says your nationalities, where you came from, what tribe you come from, what ethnicity you come. We gave these to you. وَجَعَلْنَاكُمْ شُعُوبًا وَقَبَائِلَ لِتَعَارَفُوا. We made it such that you'd come from different ethnicities and backgrounds. Because if you had 8 billion people and they all look the same background, same story, same this. Imagine now you want to give them, a driver's license. Which one is which one? So you have to have a background, you have to have an ethnicity, a name, something. The Quran says we give you a lot of these identities. No problem. Just if they ever clash with your Islamic identity, that's where I expect you to hold back over there. So someone comes and says, Sheikh, I hear what you're saying, but I'm a proud American. I'm American. Okay, no problem. How do you know I'm not a proud American or whatever? What do you even know what that means? Let's talk about what it means. Maybe I agree with you. I'm a proud American. Okay, great. He's a proud American. So what does that mean? The whole world is going to use kilograms, but I'm going to use pounds to weigh stuff. Ya Allah, can he use pounds instead of kilograms? Sure, the whole world's going to think he's weird, but yeah, it's no problem. Have at it. Not a problem. I'm an American, so what does that mean? The portions for my food have to be twice the size of everywhere else in the world. It's part of our culture. Ya Allah, can his... Yeah, no problem. It's not the best idea, especially with the healthcare we have here, yes? But okay, this is part of his custom, his identity. No problem. Ya Allah, I'm American. Okay, so what does that mean now? It means if there's a sport that they play with their feet, I want to call it soccer. If there's a sport they play with their hands, I'm going to call it football. That's not how it's supposed to work. It's weird. Everyone's going to laugh at you. But it's okay. It's part of his identity. No problem. Have at it. You go through all these different things of what it means for you and I to be American. No problem. Have all of these ideas. Then you say, yeah, I'm American. So that means I'm going to invest in this company that is mass producing weapons that's used around the world to take the lives of other people. God says, oh, no, not that one. That one clashes with your identity as a servant of God. I don't have a problem with you being American. Just in these particular areas, you have to give preference to being a servant of God. If they don't ever clash with one another, no problem, go ahead. This one comes, I'm Canadian. Okay, so what does that mean? I think hockey is very exciting. Okay. He has snow up there. Now, you can't argue against hockey. Maybe the only sport you can play up there. Okay, no problem. Now sometimes he says, I'm Canadian. So what does that mean? Well, I'm going to wipe out these indigenous people. Oh, no. That you can't do. That goes against your identity as a servant of God. You can't do that. It's not a problem against being Canadian. No, you can be Canadian in a lot of ways, more ways than you can count. But if it ever clashes with this, then you can't do it. It goes against your morals, your values. I'm British. Okay, so what does that mean? I'm going to drive on the other side of the road. Baba is going to kill a bunch of people. When visitors come to your country, they're not going to look. You're going to hit them, so on and so forth. Oh, I don't care. This is how I'm going to drive. No problem. It's not a problem. You can be British in that way. But sometimes it says, I'm British, so I'm going to colonize a bunch of countries. No. That goes against your identity as a servant of God. And this clash and dealing with situations where your identities clash with one another is something that a young man by the name of Chris Jackson dealt with very beautifully. This was a young man who was a top NBA prospect. He was a sharpshooter. Third player to be drafted in the 1990 NBA draft. For those who are familiar with basketball, that's like a big deal. Okay, I'll just say that. Sharpshooter, everything looks good for a young man who makes it into the league and is a top prospect. Okay, comes into the league, gets better every year. 1993, most improved player of the whole league. Okay, wonderful. What's the problem? Not much. 1993-ish, around that time, he decides to become Muslim. Now, this is the guy who the Stephen Currys of the world say we were inspired by the way he would shoot the ball and all this kind of stuff, yes? So he becomes Muslim, okay, still no problems. When he becomes Muslim, then all of a sudden there's a little bit of an issue because his morals and values tell him you can't be unjust to other people. On the other hand, he's standing for an anthem and a flag that, at least in his own understanding, is promoting this kind of stuff. It's part of its history, it's part of its heritage, so on and so forth. So he starts to stop standing for the anthem. Fines, suspensions, all of this kind of stuff, being attacked from every corner. This was the Kaepernick before Kaepernick, yes. Until he reaches the final point where they say, listen, you can close your eyes when the anthem is being played. That's the furthest extent that the NBA is willing to go with you. Yes? Because of this, his whole future as a top NBA prospect, imagine the wealth, imagine the opportunities, imagine the fame, imagine the connections you would have, eventually set aside from teams. Why? Because in that moment he saw that his identity as a servant of God and his identity as an employee of the NBA is clashing with one another. And he preferred the other one. So when he changed his name to Mahmoud Abdul Rauf, he saw himself more in that moment as Abdul Rauf, the son or the servant of God, than he saw himself as an NBA player. When these identities clashed, he gave preference to that identity that he found most foundational to who he was. This is what it looks like. As long as a human being does this, he's grounded in life. He knows where he's headed. He knows why he does the things that he does. The moment he forgets about this most foundational identity of his, what happens to him? He feels lost in life. And he begins to identify with other things in life. Now he starts to identify with fame. He sees himself as the one who is famous. Now he identifies with a fancy car, a fancy house, this, that. Sometimes people identify with relationships. Sometimes identify with different things. Here's the problem. When you identify with anything else other than this core identity, you know what the problem is? If any of those things are ever taken away from you in life, you fall apart. You have an identity crisis. You ever seen athletes, after they're done with their career, all of a sudden the life of this person just falls apart sometimes. He's doing like weird stuff now. Why? His whole identity was only based on what? Only based on playing this game. That's it, nothing else. He doesn't have that anymore. He's falling apart. He doesn't know who he is. This guy was the one who used to identify with his fame. Something happens, he's not famous anymore. Someone outshines him. Oh, he has an identity crisis now. He doesn't even know who he is. Can't even go to sleep at night. Because he lost his true identity. And this suffering that he has in this life continues, and it's only exacerbated when the moment of death comes. When the moment of death comes, if he used to identify with things in this world, things become very difficult for him to leave. If your identity was only this world, my fame, my car, my house, what my friends thought about me, what people thought about me, if that's what you identified with your whole life, then the moment of death comes, the angel of death comes, he's like, listen, we gotta go. It's the next part of your journey, we have to go. You're like, no, what do you mean we have to go? This is where I'm supposed to be. Don't take me away. This is what I've worked for my whole life. This is who I am. So the narrations tell us sometimes the angels who come at the time of death, they come in a very pleasant way, a welcoming way, nice way, so on and so forth, yes? And then there are times where the angels come, they are harsh and they are punishing and so on and so forth. And scholars say this is simply a representation of what this person is feeling in terms of what he used to identify with and how he feels about being pulled away from those things that he assumed was part of him. He assumed this fancy house is what makes him who he is. Now the angel's telling him we have to go. He feels torture. He doesn't want to go. But the believer, the one who had these identities, but at the end of the day, always kept his main identity in mind. The angel of death comes and tells him to go. It's easy for him. You know, you've heard about the moments of death, difficult, this, that. Yes, for some people it's not. For some people it's easy. For some people it's like a breeze. This is the wording of the narration. The sixth Imam, he narrates from the Prophet, that the Prophet said this in Al-Kafi. He says the Prophet said, if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala were to ever receive this request from a believer, that a believer were to tell him, oh Allah, don't take my soul. Ma amatahu abada. He would never take his soul. He said, how does that make sense? The Rawi, the narrator, said, that doesn't make sense. There's a lot of good people, they didn't want to die, but they died. He said, yes, let me tell you what happens. For this believer, when he wants to leave this world, initially, because it's a different world and so on and so forth, yes, initially it's very difficult for him. But the moment they start to present to him what is prepared for him, his true identity, he starts to see it, then it becomes easy for him to go. And the narration says Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sends him two breezes. Now, are these real breezes or is this a metaphor for some other reality? We don't know. But this is the way the narration is speaking. بَعَثَ اللَّهُ إِلَيْهِ الرِّيحَيْنَ رِيحًا يُقَالُ لَهَا الْمُنْسِيَةِ وَرِيحًا يُقَالُ لَهُ الْمُسْخِيَةِ. One of these breezes, Imam al-Sadiq says, comes, it's munsiya. It makes him forget about the worries and the concerns he had in this world. The other one is muskhiya. It separates him from some of the basic identities he had in this world. And then when he's separated, easy process. Then the angel asks him, do you want to go? Do you want to give up your life? And he himself decides to leave this world. He himself decides to go. Is it always difficult for everybody? No. If I only identify with the dunya, yes, this is going to be very difficult. If I show my servitude and submission and identify as a servant of God, when they want to take me to another world where everything is based off of whether or not you're a servant of God, it becomes easy for me to go. And this is why the final words of our beloved third Imam are so special. On the 10th of Muharram, those calamities were so serious, so difficult, so painful. You and I can't even imagine some of these difficulties. And then at the very end, some of the last words that are narrated of Imam al-Hussein. What did he say? He said, Allahumma anta muta'ali al-makan. Oh Allah, you are the one who's high. You know what he's doing? He's identifying as a servant. He sees himself as a servant. It's the only reason why Imam al-Hussein can go through the difficulties that he went through. Because he has already taken on this identity of, I am a servant. I don't own anything. He doesn't take a position of authority with God. Oh Allah, why this? Why? No. I'm a servant. I accept. Allahumma anta muta'al al-makan azim al-jabarut. You're the one who has jabarut. You're the one who has kingdom. I'm nobody. Shadidul mihal ghaniyun anil khalaiq. You are the one who's always in charge. You don't need your servants. Your servants need you. This is Imam al-Hussein identifying as a servant. When you and I identify as a servant, even to 100th degree of what Imam al-Hussein used to identify as a servant as. Even if to 100th degree we do that, then when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, do this, pray, fast, so on and so forth, we don't sit there and say, who is this God and this religion who keeps telling me what to do and what not to do? No, you're a servant. You don't approach Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala from a position of authority because there's no reality behind that. Your reality is that you're a servant of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and your prosperity and your happiness in this life and the akhirah also lies in that. The sooner you and I accept that, the easier and more happy of a life you and I we'll have, inshallah. Tomorrow, inshallah, we'll move on to another topic. Let us take a moment to recite Surah Al-Fatiha for all of our marhumin and marhumat, and all of those who have worked hard during these days and nights and the following days and nights to make these majalis possible for all of us, inshallah. رحم الله من قرأ سورة الفاتحة مع الصلوات على محمد وآل محمد.